Now that we've been graphing sine and cosine, we're going to take a deeper look into these. We need to be able to do the following. Determine the amplitude. We need to determine the midline. We need to determine the phase shift and the period from an equation. We also need to be able to match equations to graphs and write an equation from the graph. Now we've already learned how to identify the midline, that's whatever we're adding and subtracting by, and we've learned how to find the amplitude from the equation, and that's just our A. But there's a little bit more that we can do to find the period just by looking at it. So whatever number is in front of your x, so b times that, the period is the distance between the two sets of maximum points you could think about, points on the graph. Essentially, it's how long it takes for the graph to complete one full cycle. Now, on sine and cosine, the period was 2 pi. However, if we have transformations, it gets altered. So our phase shift is going to be the starting point. And this is essentially just where the graph begins on the x-axis. Now our period and phase shift. So whatever number's in front of the x, we're doing the opposite, so we're dividing by it, so our new period is going to be 2 pi over b. The phase shift, now it says it's c, but we have to be careful, that's only if b is factored out first. Easiest way to find the phase shift is to take whatever's in the parentheses and set it equal to 0. If you do that every time, you will find your phase shift. So the phase shift, if the b is not factored out like it is up here, would be c divided by b. Now, don't overcomplicate it. The phase shift is just the first x value on the graph, and we can just set whatever is in the parentheses equal to 0 and solve it. So the period, amplitude, midline, and phase shift. So the period, anything multiplied by x on the inside is going to affect the period. So the period would be 2 pi divided by 2, or pi. The amplitude is the number in front of cosine. The midline is wherever we moved up or down. Y equals 1. The phase shift. Notice nothing is being added or subtracted here. So if I set 2x equal to 0, phase shift, 2x equals 0, I'd get x equals 0, so there's no phase shift. We're still starting at 0. What about for this one? There's nothing being multiplied in front of x, so our period is technically 2 pi divided by 1, or just 2 pi. Our amplitude would be the number in front of sine, 3. There's nothing being added or subtracted, so our midline is our x-axis. It's when y equals 0. Nothing is being added or subtracted. Our phase shift. We take whatever's in the parentheses and set it equal to 0. So x equals negative pi over 4. That's going to be my starting point. That means I went left pi over 4. What about here? Ooh, that's really, okay, so let's rewrite that. X over 2 is really 1/2 x minus 3. Okay, so our period would be 2 pi divided by 1/2, that's the same as 2 pi times 2 over 1, which is 4 pi. The amplitude is the number in front, so 2. The midline is wherever we move up or down, so it's down 3, so it's at y equals -3. Our phase shift is whatever happens moving left or right. So x over 2 equals 0, x equals 0, so there is no phase shift. It's still starting at 0. The period, 2 pi divided by whatever's in front of x. Amplitude, there's nothing in front of sine, so that's a 1. The midline is anything being added or subtracted. This is technically a +4, so y equals 4. The phase shift, we take whatever's in the parentheses and set it equal to 0. So we're starting at pi over 2. That means we moved right pi over 2. Now, what if we were trying to write an equation? To do this, we need to find A, B, C, and D. Notice on this one we have the B kind of factored out. It makes it a lot easier. So start with the midline. So you're going to try to find the middle of your graph. That's going to be your D. The next is finding the amplitude. That's going to give me my A. Now I have to be careful with direction because if it's flipped, it'll be negative value. B, to find B, we need to find the period first. And once we find the period, we can set the period equal to 2 pi over B and solve for B. Lastly, find the starting x value on the graph. So let's look at this first example, the midline. So I'm looking, we're going from -3 to 1, so halfway would be right here. So that means my D is -1. How far am I going? So it was 4 steps, so my amplitude is 2. Notice that when x is 0, y is 0. So this is definitely sine. And it's starting at 0 and going up, so this is definitely positive. My period, that's the next thing I need to figure out. Oh, it's 2 pi. So if the period is 2 pi, then 2 pi divided by B, B is 1. I mean, there's nothing going on. And we're starting at x equals 0, so C is 0. So y equals 2 sine of, B is just 1, and x is 0, so it's just x minus 1. Again, D, midline, amplitude, 1, and it's going up first, so it's positive. The period, our period is, so 1 full cycle is pi. So if I set pi equal to 2 pi over B and solve for B, well, let's see, B pi equals 2 pi. Divide both sides by pi, so B is 2. My starting x value is at 0, so C is 0. So we got this, 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 and this. So y equals A, which is just a 1 on this one, sine of B times x minus 0, so just x, and then plus our D, which is a -1. Now this one, notice it's starting at a maximum. I think I want to use cosine for this one. All right. What is our midline? Well, the midline here is 0. Amplitude is 3. The period is, how long does it take to make one full cycle? 2 pi, which means b is 1. And it's starting when x is 0, so our phase shift is 0. So this is just 3 cosine x. Let's see about this one. Okay, it's starting on the midline, so that's got to be a sine, but it's going down first. That means my a is going to be negative. Our d is -1. Our amplitude is 1, but since we're going down first, I'm going to make that a -1. The period is from here to here, so the period is pi. Okay, so pi equals 2 pi divided by b, so b has to be 2. C. Oh, we're starting at 0. So -1 sine of 2x, I'm not moving anywhere, then -1. Which of the following graphs would be -3 cosine of 2x plus 1? So the plus 1 means that we're going to have a midline at 1. So here I'm going from -2 to 4. So that means my amplitude is 3. So amp is 3. That means my midline is at 1. So that's a contender. This one is also going from -2 to 4. So both of those are contenders, okay? -2, oh, they all have a center line at 1. Okay, so that didn't help. Also, they all have an amplitude of 3. Okay, well, that did not narrow it down. Negative cosine. So cosine normally starts at a maximum. So this one's going to start at a minimum. And notice there's nothing being added or subtracted to the x, so there's no phase shift. So it is going to start at, because it's negative, a minimum. So this one starts at a minimum. This one starts at a maximum. This one starts at a minimum. And this one starts at a minimum. So we've narrowed it down. Now we need to look at the period. So 2x, the period would be 2 pi divided by 2, or pi. So we need to look for where one full cycle happens in pi. So minimum to minimum. Now this one goes all the way to 4 pi. It's definitely not it. This one goes to 2 pi. That's not it. It's got to be that one. It makes one full cycle in a pi. There is no mastery check on this one. So I would like for you to work on this today and tomorrow. You can work on the practice problems. You can also catch up on 4.2 and 4.3. If you are absent, the videos are online. I suggest working together. You can also put your calculator in radians and put these in the calculator if you want to double check your answers.